Welcome to the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast, a podcast where people want to learn all things about maintenance reliability. I'm your host, Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of UpKeep. In each episode, I'll be meeting with an expert from within our maintenance reliability community to take a deep dive into topics that help elevate the entire industry. Today, I'm super excited to have Lucas Marino, my friend, back here on the show. Lucas does a ton of everything. He is a lifecycle engineer at Amentum. He is the assistant professor at Old Dominion University. He's a principal consultant of his own consulting firm, and he's also running his own business as the CEO of East Partnership. Lucas, you do quite a bit. Welcome to the podcast, Lucas, again, and super excited to learn from you.
Yeah, appreciate the invite, Ryan. As always, it's always great to come hang out with you. And one of the great parts about the maintenance community is being able to keep interacting with your team and with you. And so I appreciate it, man. This is awesome. We'll just jump in.
We always start off the show by asking you to share a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how you were first introduced into this field of maintenance and reliability.
I was a diesel engine technician basically in the Coast Guard for about 9 years. And then I became a naval engineer officer. I got commissioned halfway through my career. So my introduction to maintenance and reliability in a formal setting was in the military. It was in the Coast Guard. And so I was at the end of the wrench, right? That's where it started. And then I was doing all the things that maintenance engineers and reliability engineers prescribe. And then as I got more mature in my development as a technician, I started to understand, oh, wait, there's this logical analysis and stuff behind this. That's when I was introduced to reliability engineering, RCM, those types of things. And I progressed with that through the latter half of my career. And when I decided to retire from the Coast Guard, I reached out to a couple of retired coasties that are in maintenance and reliability now, like Tom Moriarty and Hank Kosovar and those guys. And they all took me under their wing and said, let me introduce you to this community outside of the military circle. And that's how I got introduced to the M&R community, in the industrial sector. So that's kind of how it went.
All right. And I know that you do a lot of work with the Navy as well. Could you share a little bit more about how you got involved with that? And
when I was in the Coast Guard, I became an acquisition officer, which is, if you're going to buy large ships and complex systems and stuff, you have to have people that have field experience, engineering experience, that kind of stuff, that can come into those offices and advise and help build and design and purchase the right thing. So they encourage naval engineers to get into acquisitions. So that was closer to my exit from the service. And I stepped into the civilian sector. I went to work for an Army acquisition, building and designing an Army landing craft. And that contract actually got me introduced to another person who worked for the Navy. And they said, hey, we saw your research that you did for your doctorate, and we love what you're doing with the Army. Why don't you come talk to us? I went and talked to them. They said, would you like to be an advisor on the Columbia submarine program, which is the newest fleet of nuclear submarines? And I said, man, that sounds amazing. How can you, what a cool thing to be involved with. And then I figured out, I learned a little bit more about the submarine itself, and I was in. This thing is insanely cool. So it was kind of like being invited to work on a shuttle. Yes, where do I sign up, And so that's how I got involved with the Navy. And so now I'm a senior advisor to what's known as a product support manager. And when you buy a complex weapon system like a submarine or a ship or a fleet of planes, there's one person that's responsible for all of the in-service sustainment planning, all the maintenance, all the logistics, everything. And that person is the product support manager, and I'm one of his senior advisors. So that's what I do for the Navy.
That's awesome. And obviously right before we hit record here, we're kind of talking about your exposure into the global supply chain issues going on and how you kind of have this very interesting perspective, kind of seeing it from being a consultant, being a professor, and also kind of seeing it from the Navy perspective too. I would love to kind of get your perspective about what's going on with, this global supply chain issue.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously impactful on the general public, right? And then has a rolling wave effect over every industry, including, government. And so anytime industry is impacted by something like supply chain criticality, shortages, whatever, if those industries also support the construction or support of government assets, the government feels it as well. So, I felt it in several areas of my life, both as a consumer and as someone who supports the design and development of a complex thing that consumes a lot of materials. So we have industrial-based shortages, just like most industries do. And some of it is being compounded right now by material shortages, supply chain shortages, the just-in-time lean supply chain methodologies of the last, I don't know, few decades at a minimum in government and even further than that in some other areas have kind of come to roost. And I think they were just amplified by the disruption of all industries this last, year and a half with COVID. So we're feeling it.
Yeah, and you're obviously seeing it in basically all parts of your business personally, consulting, even being part of, at least as an advisor for the Navy.
Yeah, we've got a huge issue, just like many of the people listening to this do right now, with not only labor shortages in trades, but also in supply chain shortages due to the impact. And this isn't just overseas from China. This is also domestic, because we're associating a lot of the supply chain woes as consumers based off of consumer goods. A lot of those goods come from overseas. And so that's kind of like what is in the news, right? But the stuff that's being amplified that we've already been dealing with in the industrial sectors for many years now are the same supply chain shortages in the supply sector domestically, and the labor shortages domestically, that in some ways are impacted by those overseas transactions, but in many ways are just impacted by our own domestic policies and capabilities. For example, with building submarines, we didn't have the ability to just fire up the machine and start, founding parts. So they built a foundry. They had to go establish a foundry, though. That's like, it's a big deal.
That's a big deal, for sure.
It produces the biggest parts of its kind in the world. And that was really the big thing, was like, it's not just about like whether you have certain capabilities, do you have them the way you need them? And that's where some of the industries are really short right now. You have rollover effect of things like oil and gas and inflation. And so,
it's so interesting. What's the solution here, Lucas? Because like Biden the other day said, Port of LA is going to be working around the clock. Like everyone's going to work 24/7, whatever. What's the solution here?
Yeah, well, like most really difficult problems, they're multifaceted, multivariable equations. They will fix certain things with government intervention, but they can't fix all of it, right? Which is fairly obvious to most people. But the president, Congress, all of these government bodies, they have certain powers and certain things they can do to stimulate areas of the supply chain, like investments, financially, putting tax dollars into certain programs, moving resources around that maybe industry is a little hesitant to move around without some financial incentives. They can do that kind of stuff. But I think really what we need is some time and some really good thinking, right? People need to start making better decisions about how to source materials domestically. And even international, I think, has to be rethought, because let's say you're not very fond of dependence on China for all these goods. Like pharmaceuticals is in the news right now, obviously, right? So pharmaceutical dependencies on a company or a country like China might seem like a strategic imperative, like to fix, and it really is. But that will take time, because you have to then substitute it with some other capability to develop that same thing at the right level of quality and for the right price and the right quantities. And so, if you're going to do that internationally, it's going to take government intervention for companies to be able to figure out which company to invest in. Maybe there's incentives provided by the government to other governments to help establish those types of capabilities. Like Mexico has been incentivized for certain types of industrial production. I know a guy that I talked to 2 weeks ago who owns a steel, fabrication company in Texas. He does everything for the US government in Texas. He does everything for industry in Mexico, right? So he's got basically two different businesses under one roof, and it's divided by customer. He can't do Mexican business for the US government building warships, so he has to do that domestically. But that doesn't make financial sense for industry partners. So he goes to Mexico for his industry stuff like cranes, big metal bucket fabs, all that kind of stuff. He goes to Mexico and works with a prime or a subcontractor in Mexico to help with that. And it's no difference in quality. They're using the same steel, they're just using a different labor force. And it helps his company survive both the industrial sector fluctuations and sustain government work. So
I was talking to an economist yesterday, actually, and he was kind of talking about like the solve here is ultimately like diversification.
Yep.
And just like we talk about like in reliability, having spare parts, having backups, having this like plan B, knowing that something can and will always go wrong, it is extremely important. But ultimately, what we also talked about is like that all leads to increased cost.
Yeah.
Like having a spare part on hand in stock leads to, increased cost.
It's significant cost too. And so what we have to do is we have to reevaluate our risk posture and our perception of balance. This is just my opinion. We have established over the last few decades a very lean posture when it comes to supply chain management. And I think that in some industries, that's going to have to continue. But in other industries, where there's dependencies and codependencies between industries in a way that are kind of critical to infrastructure and critical to operations and things like that, we're going to have to come up with a different perception on balance and risk, because we can't keep doing it the way we're doing it now and expect different results unless we, implement some change with our existing resources, right? So really what it comes down to is like, you can change the way you think about the problem and manage it, and you can change the way you manage resources. And providers are resources, sources of supply are resources, government funding and programs are resources. And if you don't think for a second that all these, big profit companies aren't working through lobbyists and government right now to try and impact changes in government policy to make that happen, then you're not paying attention, because that's really how this is going to work. So you're going to see financial governmental repercussions of this event this year, 3 to 5 years from now, because of the budget cycle in the US government.
Totally agree with that. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. And, the more that we're talking about this, I know we're talking about like supply chain issues, but like, and it always reminds me and brings me back to like, essentially our industry in reliability. Like, I think that there are a lot of practices around like reliability, risk management, how to like calculate risk and what to do in different scenarios very much relate to like what's going on right now with the supply chain issue.
Yes. And reliability engineers have a unique viewpoint on things like you brought up in the beginning of the conversation, like redundancy.
Yep.
Right? So our perception of the risk of redundancy might be different from the people leading operations in the same organization. They may just be so focused on not interrupting operations, and we may be focused on system specific designs and functionality and sustainment and that type of stuff. But you got to come together to create like that balance we were just talking about within the organization.
When you look at supply chain, who's responsible for running like risk analysis on that side?
Yeah, so this to me is teamwork. We were always pit against the supply officers, right? The engineer and the supply officer were always like at each other. When I needed something, he was either the savior or not. Either the part was on hand and I was happy that it was in the right condition, or it wasn't there and they were having to work magic to make it happen. But the reality is, despite the friendly, harassment and all that, we were just one big happy family. And we actually needed each other, because maintenance is the driver for everything supply chain. Without a maintenance activity, there wouldn't be a supply chain demand as significant as it is. So the supply chain exists to support the maintenance activities, and the maintenance activities exist to support operations. And so the three have to work in unison to make the well-oiled machine actually function as it's supposed to. So the supply chain, if they really want to be as supportive of operations, if you have a delay associated with a supply issue, that can be documented in metrics. And you can start using that as a reporting function on not necessarily why we have, or why, that we have downtime, but why we have downtime. If it's supply chain related, you should be tracking that. And then you should be working with the supply chain gurus to come up with a feasible solution if it's a supply chain shortage or a sourcing problem, because they don't understand the equipment the way you do. They need your expertise and insight. And I'll give you a good example of this. Way back, we had these diesel engines put in ships that were basically 60s technologies, 70s production, 80s operations. So by the time the late 90s roll around, they're in the heyday of making parts. Well, by the 2000s, they're not making these engines anymore. The company's not incentivized to keep producing parts. And the stock system for the government was fat, right? They had all these parts. Well, we're picking away at that stock over the years. Eventually what happened was all the OEM parts have been expended, and other small businesses are now incentivized to create these parts, but they can't meet the quality standards. And no one actually caught that someone other than the OEM was putting parts in the stock system.
Yeah.
The stock system, when it was left to its own devices, was like, I need a part with this number. And they went, who can give it to me? And this company did it. And they bought a bunch of them. And then we put them on ships, and they're failing left and right. And all the technicians are going, what's wrong with these things? And then we realized, wait, these are just not sufficient quality. We had to go back to the manufacturer, say, hey, why aren't you making these parts anymore? They said, you don't buy them from us anymore. You buy them from company X. How much would it cost for you to fire up the production line?
Yeah.
We need a contract with no less than $10 million to fire the machine back up to make all these parts. So we had to create a long-term contract to incentivize the OEM to start producing parts again so that we could sustain 32 ships that depended on these engines.
That's actually very interesting. I never really thought about maintenance affecting supply chain and how it does really come full circle.
Yeah, we are the supply, we're the demand signal.
And that must be a very expensive lesson.
Yeah, well, lessons that the US government has because they're not required to produce a profit to survive, they can survive those types of things. It becomes even more critical for an organization that does require profit to survive, because they report on productivity differently, right? Like the US government, A sub O, operational availability for a military asset is everything. Like, is it available and it can be used? Yes. Okay, then we have defense, or we have, offense, whatever the case is. But with production companies, you're losing money every minute, every second that system is down, and they may not be able to absorb the same amount of that failure as the US government can. So they should be even more critical for them.
We talk about redundancy. We talk about how it increased costs. I think the part that I'm struggling with right now is ultimately the cost gets passed down to the consumer, but the consumer is always going to choose the lowest cost option. If all things are the same, they'll choose the lowest cost option. And then we go back into this cycle of, reduced cost just in time, which creates more risk. And then the bubble kind of pops again. And to me, I'm just thinking in my head, is this just a cycle that we're just going to continue going through? Like you said, we optimized costs, did this whole lean manufacturing just in time. We have this global crisis right now. In 4 to 5 years, we're going to start seeing laws, regulation, support, this diversification. And then I'm wondering, is it in 10 years from now where we go back to where we were today, or where we were 2 years ago, and then the cycle just starts over again? Is that?
There's some really smart people trying to work on those types of predictions right now, right? They're really trying to figure out how is this going to impact us decades from now, not just months from now or even a year. I mean, the American citizen has to think closer proximity, right? There are people that have to look more long-term in business and in government, but the American citizen is going to be concerned about the right now. So I worked with a PhD who was a mathematician, and he would tell me hey, this is like a scrum in rugby, more so than a play in football. And it'll take all this effort to move the ball this far, and then it stops, and then that same pile moves the ball back this way a little bit. And what'll happen is eventually it moves down the field. It takes a whole lot of people and a whole lot of energy to move the ball a very short distance. And unfortunately, right now, what we're experiencing is that ball is moving faster than we're used to, right? There's a ton of effort being exerted in that scrum, but we're moving faster than our economy is set up to support. Hence, the drastic inflation we're experiencing right now is also associated with these things. How do we slow inflation? How do we correct the supply chain woes? It's going to take time to fix all these things. They're not going to come all the way back, in my opinion, especially pricing. And so one of my worries is that there will be a self-correction in production, but there may not be an accompanying self-correction in pricing. and that eventually everything's just kind of steady out and it's going to be at a higher level than what we saw previous to the event. So I have a question for you, because I think that, the type of goods that we're talking about also matter, right? Like, so for critical goods, it's obviously going to be impactful in a way, but then you have goods that are like maybe not as tangible, like not physical materials, like, steel and oil and things like that, natural goods that are converted. There's a high cost of conversion, all that kind of stuff. But like, how does this impact things like the software industry or consultants that, maybe their products aren't necessarily changing, but your partners in the hardware industry, they definitely are, because they're sourcing raw materials, right? So
we were actually just talking about this yesterday, but like, we're seeing labor shortage increase like prices everywhere. And what that's really focusing a lot of people on is like how to reduce costs. And they turn to technology, whether that's software, hardware, robotics, automation, as one potential route to do all of this. But right now, what's going on in technology is there's a huge software, technology, hardware, robotics boom.
Yep.
There's a ton of money being invested in this because, to your point, Lucas, people are thinking about what this is going to impact over the next 5 to 10 years. And what people are realizing is that the problems are not really going to get too much easier. The challenges around, labor shortage, increasing prices, the want to drive down cost is only going to continue, if not increase.
I think you're in a great industry for that. And obviously, you're in a prime position to help people that do need to cut those costs. I'm a recipient of those types of services, not necessarily from UpKeep products, because I don't own the type of facility that uses them. But as a small business owner, I can invest in software to help me. But because of the labor shortage, that's not always a bad thing. I carry a lower overhead burden because of that. And then when we talk about like skilled trades, that's a whole different story. Like, it's going to be helpful that we can transition to technology to solve some of these problems. In other areas, we still have a high dependency on physical labor and physical skills being exerted by human beings. And I think that the focus, like rolling back over to like, hey, maybe not everyone needs to go to college to become a doctor. Maybe some people need to, go become master electricians, and that's the right place for them, and they can be, reimbursed in a career in a very successful way. That's becoming more tangible and realistic and more popular now than it was maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I see that starting to, it's kind of building off the same theme you brought up, where there's options now, and there's not so much stigma associated with software as a solution. Software as a solution was like an anomaly to some companies 20 years ago. Now it's like everyday decision making.
It's the expectation.
Yeah.
And, I think I draw like a kind of fine line between this two, because we talk about it, all the time with our customers, prospects, like, okay, what does this mean for me as, maintenance technician in my future career here? And what we always say is like, software, technology, automation, there are two roles that it's going to look at replacing first. It's mundane, very low skill jobs. Second one is high risk of, injury, death, those are the two roles. But roles like a technician, where you're really, it is a high skill, high labor job. Like, I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon.
No, I don't think so either. In fact, I think it's going to increase, because I think the demand signal for technology is in some way parallel with the increase of physical asset development in this country.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a company like UpKeep isn't supporting themselves. You're supporting customers that are building and producing things. Yeah. And that sector is growing again, which is good. Even though locally, some people may not feel that growth. I get that, sometimes it's anecdotal, the feeling people have when they hear that kind of news. But I think if you look, across the country, there's a lot of opportunity right now to kind of expand physical assets and their impact on infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure bill is a good example. I live off of Interstate 64 in Virginia, and anyone who's ever been up and down the East Coast knows that Interstate 64 is never not under construction. And they just completed a 20-mile stretch of I-64 in like record time, because they're being smarter about how they're investing the money and incentivizing contractors. They're not just incentivizing like perform forever. They're incentivizing perform better in shorter periods of time. And oh, by the way, if you do well, there's another contract waiting for you on the backside. And so I think you're starting to see a little bit better management of business, better management of contracts, better management of labor. And I agree with you. I think the demand for skilled labor is just increasing with in alignment with the increased technology, because the more technology advances, the more skilled labor you need to use it.
When people think about technology, they just think software, but they kind of forget like there's so much technology that goes into equipment lines, assets. Like it's really cool actually to see that.
So we bought all this equipment for a class of ships when I was in the Coast Guard. $600 million ship, right? $600 million, you're going to pay a shipyard to build it. We want, let's just say 10 or 12 of them, right? So they're going to build each of these ships. They're almost a carbon copy of each other as they roll out. They can build these ships in like amazing time, right? They get really efficient as they go. We walk on board. They bought engine package for propulsion, engine packages for power generation, engine packages for this, and then controls all over the place. Before you know it, 36 different PLCs on the ship. That takes a new type of electrician to work with 36 different types of PLCs. We weren't prepared for that. We had the thing in our hands before we realized we had a problem. We were like, oh, wait, we really need to change the way we're training our electricians, because they have to troubleshoot all these different PLC systems and we haven't trained them for any of this. They're better now than they were 10 years ago.
All right, Lucas, we have a segment on the end of the show where we do a quick fire set of questions. I ask you a question, get your response in 20 seconds or less. You ready?
Yes.
All right. I'd love to know, Lucas, what's the technology you're most excited about that you think will leave a lasting impact on the industry?
Batteries. I'm fascinated by simple advancements. How does batteries get so crazy over like 20 years? Like a battery today is leagues ahead of where it was before, and it is impacting everything. You know, we're moving to those unmanned vehicles, like you said. They're all going to be requiring batteries. When battery technology advances, every bit of this moves with it. So that's pretty cool stuff.
Favorite memory of the biggest win you've had in the maintenance reliability space?
Okay, I'll give you two. I'll give you one as a technician and one as a non-technician. As a technician, I fixed something that we had been unable to fix for multiple years, and then implemented a new maintenance strategy so that we could completely eliminate the problem. We were inducing our own issue. We didn't realize it. And then post-military, post-technical, when I completed my first FAMICA and I stepped back and looked at what the impact was going to be of a well-executed analysis and how it was going to impact everything they did to support that asset from there on out, that was just like super rewarding and humbling. So,
That's awesome.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that, Lucas, biggest mistake you've made that you've learned a ton from?
Trying to do everything myself. And it doesn't matter if it was as a technician or as a business owner or as an advisor. You have to know when to you're hurting the situation more than you're helping it by not bringing someone else in. So, you know, this last year, I've invested heavily in coaches and other mentors to help me become a better professional, because although I may have been great at the things I did, I've never been a salesman or a marketer, and I don't do that like as a business. So, you know, getting smarter sometimes means bringing people in to help you with that. You can't just learn it in a book.
What about the best career advice that you've ever been given?
Be an optimist and learn how to communicate with people in a constructive way. That absolutely was the best thing, because no matter what happened, whether things were good or bad, that's always a valued skill set. And the people who don't control that, and they don't control the controllables, in particular their own performance and behavior and outlook, tend not to succeed as much. And I think that is a tremendous lesson to learn.
Absolutely. Lucas, thank you so much for going through this quick fire set of questions with me. And lastly, can you just share with all of our listeners the different ways that they can connect with you, follow you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I try to stay real active in the maintenance community. So I'm there. You can find me on LinkedIn. And you can also reach me via email at lucas@eastpartnership.org.
All right. Thank you again, Lucas, for joining us. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast. My name again is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of UpKeep. You can also connect with me. I'm super active on LinkedIn. You can find me and also Lucas in the maintenance community Slack group, as you mentioned. You can feel free to ask us any follow-up questions from today's podcast, or you can also suggest any future topics. You can sign up at upkeep.org. I hope to connect with all of you soon. Until next time, thank you again, Lucas.
Thanks, Ryan.